Now, a reflection on the essence of beauty. Peter France turns his attention from the birds that we've had singing all through Dawn Chorus Day here on BBC Radio 4 to look instead at us as we listen to them. Why do we find birdsong so beautiful, he asks, in music to our ears?
The beauty of birdsong is timeless. 3,000 years ago, King Solomon was inspired to write poetry about it. The rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, and the time of the singing of birds is come. And people have always felt, as I do this morning, sitting outside my own back door in Devon, that the birds are celebrating, that they're singing for the pure joy of being alive. But the scientists tell us today we've got it all wrong. All the birds are saying is either come and mate with me or push off, this is my place. Now where's the beauty in that? If that's really the true explanation of birdsong, then why do we find it so beautiful? Perhaps the answer does lie somewhere in biology, or perhaps in psychology, or in our understanding of music or philosophy. Or is the true essence of the beauty in these sounds to be found at a deeper, maybe a spiritual level? In this program, that's what I'm going to explore.
Well, the first of the people who've agreed to talk to me is Peter Slater, who is Professor of Natural History at the University of St Andrews. And in addition to that, is someone for whom music is an important part of life. Can you tell me, thinking back all those years ago when you began to study birdsong, did you find it aesthetically pleasing in the way that, for example, you love music?
Well, I think all of us who are interested in birdsong have something of that in it. But birdsong is also a wonderful subject biologically because it sheds light on such a huge array of different issues. And we can study it in a great deal of detail in a way that we can't many other aspects of animal behavior. So I think there's a lot of that in it as well.
But there is something to us, isn't there, as human beings, appealing about it. Do you know what that is?
Well, birdsongs are often rather rhythmical, which is something we have in our music as well. You can often get very pure notes. I mean, in Nightingale song, there's those wonderful whistles. They start speeding up at the beginning of a song, which sounds absolutely gorgeous, I think. And those sort of features are some things that they have in common with our song, and which I think do switch us on in a way to interest in it. But the complexity, the variety, the fact that it's repeated eventually. I mean, birds don't just sit there and improvise and spill out anything that comes into their heads. Their songs are actually fixed. They are repeated eventually. They come back again, which is the same in many aspects of our music. So I think there are aspects in common here between human music and birdsong.
One of the things I wanted to ask you was whether the songs specifically directed at being attractive, i.e. sort of mating songs, which are meant to attract females, are they, to our ears, more pleasing than the songs which are, say, territorial?
Well, they tend to be more varied. Songs which attract females are very often extraordinarily elaborate, wonderfully varied. Things like Nightingale song, song thrush song, robin song, and so on, are much more varied than the song of, say, a chaffinch or a great tit. Mm-hmm. That said, all of these birds use song to attract females. It's just that in some species, sexual selection seems to have picked on songs and made them much, much, much more varied, rather like the tail of a peacock or something like that. Mm-hmm. So the male is using a huge amount of variety, and that, again, of course, is something that we find very, very attractive. I mean, if you get a league table of songs, things like nightingales and song thrushes tend to come up near the top of it in human perception, and I suspect that these are ones where sexual selection has got hold of it, and females are being quite choosy. Males have to produce very varied songs if they're going to get chosen.
But is this biologically efficient in the sense, do the best singers necessarily make the best mates?
Well, the females seem to be able to assess various things about the male. It may be direct things about him. I mean, if he's built up a large repertoire, he may have developed better. He may be better at feeding himself, and therefore be better at feeding your chicks.
He's likely to be older, isn't he?
He's quite likely to be older. I mean, it varies a lot from species. One of the wonderful things about birdsong is that no two species seem the same, so it varies an awful lot from species to species, but it is certainly true. In some species, the older the male, the bigger his song repertoire.
Well, in a way, one could suggest perhaps that isn't biologically efficient, because it could be some chap who's nearing the 70 years and 10 in bird terms.
Well, that might be true, but at least he's lasted, you know. I mean, if longevity is heritable in any way, choosing an older male for a female may be a rather good thing to do, because your sons are liable to live longer and have more years to breed in, and you'll leave more grandchildren and so on. So there may be advantages, you know, that old males don't have it all against them.
So we've established that the female's drawn to the male by the variety of the song, but what is it in her that's responding? Is she calculating it mathematically? Is she responding spontaneously? Does she have, as it were, aesthetic taste in this matter?
I don't think we need to propose that females are calculating mathematically. I think that would be rather a tall order for a wee bird. But in some way, they are stimulated more by more varied songs than less varied songs. And I think one can understand this really quite easily. I mean, we habituate very quickly to things which are the same again and again and again, like a fan and or something tedious like that. What the male is attempting to do, or appears to be attempting to do, is minimizing the possibility that the female will habituate, think in anthropomorphic terms how boring, and fly away. So the male is producing as much variety as possible. Now, maybe all that he is really doing is stimulating more of her nerves to fire in some sort of way, and the more novel and varied his song is, the more her nerves will continue to fire and she will be stimulated by him. Now, I wouldn't want to use words like measurement or calculation there. He is being selected to maximize the extent to which her brain is stimulated, and it's just as simple as that. Very hard to test the idea that this is an aesthetic sense or anything like that, but as females will work to hear male song, and they will work to hear more varied song more than they will work to hear less varied song in some cases, then it does suggest that there is something rewarding to her in the more varied song of a really good singing male.
But is there any evidence, would you say, overall, that females find birdsong beautiful?
Well, beauty is in the ear of the beholder, and unfortunately I can't get into the head of a bird to tell you the answer to that question.
Well, Peter Slater was confessing his inability to get inside the head of a female bird, and perhaps it might be easier to get inside the head of human beings. Chris McManus is Professor of Psychology at the University College London, and he's made a special study of the psychology of aesthetics. Well, I've got a very specific question, which may sound simple, but doubtless it might exercise you a little at the moment. Why do we find things beautiful? Do we know?
Well, I suppose some sounds we like for almost physical reasons. After all, if I play two notes together and they're in a harmony to one another, they're in an octave or a fifth or something like that, then there's a physical reason. The sounds are literally vibrating in exactly the right mathematical proportions, and that's almost certainly what we like about that. And you just change the note of one so that it's a discord, and we dislike it intensely. So sometimes we get that sort of reason for liking it. Other times there's just a purely sensory quality to things. If you hear a pure note played on a flute, or a beautiful deep bowed sound on a cello, or whatever, big loud chord on an electric guitar, they have a sensory quality which is nothing to do with any high-level analysis. And I suspect that's much the same as a bird or a bee may like a flower of a particular colour because it tells it something. It just resonates inside it.
It has a sensory quality, and the flute is different from a chainsaw.
Absolutely.
But they are both giving you a sensory input into your eardrums. They're both vibrations. Why do we like one and not the other?
Well, if you connect up the sound of a chainsaw or the sound of a flute to a machine that can analyse the various frequencies, you'll find that the chainsaw is made up of all the frequencies. It's just noise. There's no relationship between them. Whereas the notes of the flute, particularly a very purely blown flute, are all in precise mathematical relationships to one another. They're all harmonics. And if you play a flute badly, then you actually introduce notes which aren't harmonics, breathy, noisy sounds, and it's those same sounds which, when they're exaggerated, become the noise of the chainsaw. And in fact, it's quite interesting. Charles Darwin pointed out that the very basics are there even in birdsong, that they have the octaves and the thirds and the fifths, because these come out of any mechanical system that's going to be producing notes. And it's just inevitable a system will do that. It's the way they resonate.
So you're saying really that the pleasure in music comes from a mathematical relationship between the sounds that we're hearing?
I think the low-level sensory properties of music, that's why a flute sounds nice. But I think the reason a Beethoven string quartet sounds nice is because there's a deep structure there, which we're finding. There's rhythmic properties, there's harmonic relationships, there's counterpoint and all that sort of stuff. And we suspect there's something going on there that we like to play around with ideas because it helps us to understand the world better. If by listening to music and recognizing variations on a theme or something like that, I can also recognize the sounds around me better in the jungle or wherever where primitive man was living, and as a result I can classify the birds and animals better. I can know when there's a tiger likely to be nearby, where there's a bear that's frightened or angry and it's going to be trying to attack me. If any of those things help me to understand my world better, then I'm going to get some advantage from it.
But why do we find it pleasurable? Is it neurological, or is it something cultural? Do we learn?
I think it's both. I think most things in life which are pleasurable have a component of both. If things are useful in evolutionary terms, then it's highly desirable we do them. And if it's desirable we do them, the best way of making us do them is actually to make us enjoy them, because then we do them of our own volition, if you like, rather than having to be made to do them. And that applies to everything from, eating to sex to whatever. They're all essential for survival, and they're all really rather nice.
And does all this then apply to birdsong?
Well, I'm not sure it applies from the bird's point of view. There's no evidence that the birds do any of these things, and there's no evidence that the birds need to do it. And there are bird songs which are intensely unpleasant, and so I think we can conclude that, I don't know if you've come across the brain fever bird, there's different species in both Africa and India which are called brain fever birds, simply because their sounds are so intolerable. Nobody likes them. They wake them up in the morning, and it's as if you've got a Victorian's called a brain fever coming on. So it's not always attractive. And what we as humans do is divide bird song up into that which is produced by what we call the songbirds. We differentiate them from the other sorts of birds. And, a little sparrow that goes cheep cheep, we don't think that's particularly attractive because it's not a songbird. So what bird song is telling us about is probably nothing, or the aesthetics of bird song is telling us about, is nothing to do with the bird's view of that music and everything to do with the way the human brain works.
So it seems that science can talk to us about beauty and even try and give us an explanation of it. And what science seems to me to be saying is that beauty is either some stimulation of our nerve endings, which gives us pleasure, or it's something which satisfies our basic need for order. And now, both of these explanations to me seem to be partial, inadequate. I daren't say downright wrong, but let's say I want to push a little further. And the next person I'm going to talk to is David Rothenberg, who's just written a book called The Book of Music and Nature. He's a composer, an academic, a jazz clarinetist. And a couple of weeks ago, he took his clarinet into the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, and he improvised. David, what exactly were you doing?
Well, I had been very excited about going to the National Aviary to play with these birds because I had been talking about these things for several years now. And, I had been putting together this book which shows in many ways music and nature are connected. I've been making music with pre-recorded bird sounds and trying to learn from bird songs and adapt that in musical ways. But I hadn't actually gone out there and played live with birds to see what would happen. And in the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, it's one of the best places to do that because they have wonderful birds from all over the world, and they'll let you go in there and play with them at certain early hours of the day when it's closed.
Is what you were playing music?
Oh, I think so. You know, music is taking sound and exploring it and listening to it purely for its own pleasure, not for any other purpose. And that's what I was playing.
There are sounds which are not music and sounds which are. Can you help me understand the difference?
Well, you know, given the vast amount of music that exists today and, you know, and just how open our ears are, you know, as human beings, these days pretty much music is what is any sound you put on to enjoy, you know, for itself, you know, is listening to sound as sound and not signifying anything else. But, you know, in a way, this discussion is that of what music is and what isn't music is sort of far away from the sounds of birds, because most people listen to them and say, oh, how musical it is. Doesn't this sound like music? Now, some scientists like to say, well, you know, it's really a language, something's being said. It's purely for communication, it's purely for sexual advantage. We can explain this. You know, science is good at investigating why things are done, but it's harder at getting inside things.
Is science not really able to explain the beauty of birdsong?
It's not really interested in the most interesting questions, because it wants you know, the song to have an explanation.
But the notion of beauty, which is the one we're toying with at the moment, is a human notion. Do we have to have people around for a thing to be beautiful?
Well, as far as we know, it's a human notion. It may be arrogance to assume it's only a human notion. Birdsong is a challenge to the idea that human beings are needed for beauty to be in the world, because there were birds singing long before people were singing or talking. I think it is very limiting and naive to say that you need to have people around to appreciate this, you know. It's very possible that we learned our sense of beauty from listening to bird songs. They were around before us. You know, I'm more interested in music coming from birdsong than what most scientists seem to be interested, which is the idea that language might come from bird songs and animal sounds. Because look at it this way, if you meet someone who speaks a language you don't understand, you can't talk to them unless you have some common language. If you meet a musician from some other part of the world, you might not be able to talk to them, but you can start playing music with them immediately. Because the commonalities of music are more basic than those of speaking of language. And that's what I think I was trying to do with these birds. Let's just see, I'll play some sounds, see how they respond.
But what do you think makes birdsong beautiful?
Well, first of all, I'd say just go out and listen to it. You know, hear the exuberance, the invention, the possibility, the sense of energy. It just sounds alive. It sounds like a celebration of what it means to be alive, what it means for the dawn to break, for spring to come. You know, too often people just listen to a bird song to identify the bird. Ah, there's a white-throated sparrow. Ah, it's a robin. And then they stop listening. What's more interesting is to keep listening. You know, take the time and take it seriously and realize how beautiful the natural world is right around us. And it's not something so far away from the human world. It's open to us if we have the time for it.
For David Rothenberg, then, the beauty of birdsong is that it brings you into direct contact with beauty through experience and not through theorizing. Now, I'd like to take perhaps an unexpected step here, because the idea of the value of something being in the direct experience of it is not only an artistic, but also a religious concept. Martin Palmer is Secretary-General of the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. Martin, would I be right in suggesting that the beauty of sounds, often of natural sounds, is linked to religious truth?
Oh, I think they are intimately linked. In many of the great faiths, the relationship between the givenness of the universe and the sound of the universe is one that cannot be separated. For example, if you take within Hinduism, you have the notion that the sound Om is the actual original sound of creation. And in Taoism, every single note that is used in the liturgy and the worship and in the evocation of Taoism is rooted in sounds that have been taken from nature. So if you like, Taoism is actually saying, if you want to understand the very nature of being, listen to it, and listen to it through the music. And what Taoism did was to trap 13 fundamental sounds, which it believed embodied the whole of the universe. And those sounds might be something like, for example, Peter, the sound of water falling on a stone, because in that sound you have 3 elements: water, air, and stone, or earth, rock, the hard substance of the very foundation of the earth. And those are 3 of the building blocks of the universe. But I think perhaps if one was to illustrate where Taoism sees sound, is to parallel it with Greek thought. In Greek thought it was said, and I'm trying to remember who it was, I think it was Euclid, said that if you could find the exact place in space in which to rest a lever, you could flip the world by a simple reed, because you could get the right pressure. The Chinese say, Zhuangzi, one of the great philosophers from the 4th century BC, said, if you could hit the absolute fundamental note of the world, if you could make the fundamental sound of the universe, you could make the entire universe shiver. And I think in that difference between a Greek philosophical approach that wants to actually shift the earth and move it off its axis, and the Taoist one of shivering the entire cosmos, you have perhaps an encapsulation of why Taoism takes sound so seriously.
And when you say takes sound seriously, are sounds made in the course of Taoist liturgy, Taoist worship?
Yes, they are, and they are used to evoke. I have the great fortune of regularly visiting Taoist monasteries in the great sacred mountains in China, and there, very often, there will be a very distinctive sound which is produced by using something that has grown or been discovered on the mountain. It might be rock, it might be wood, it might be vegetable, it might even be a skull. And the sound that that creates is deemed to be the sound of that particular sacred mountain. And I'm not a Taoist, though I love it deeply, but I have been at times more profoundly moved by this sound, which the only way I can describe it, Peter, is it doesn't come from outside. These sounds begin inside you and go out. It is a most peculiar experience. In Taoism, the belief is that if you can make the right sound, if you can hit the right note, you evoke the soundness, if you like, of every aspect of creation, and all creation then joins you in this enormous movement of what is called the Tao. The Tao simply means the way of nature, but the way of nature is not so much a philosophical, theological consideration. It is an encounter with the real nature of the existence of the universe, and sound is the ultimate key that can open that experience to you.
So that's dealing with the function of sound and its relationship to the universe. What we're trying to understand in this program, what I'm trying to understand, is why birdsong itself is beautiful and moving to us all. It does seem there's a mystery about this. Could it possibly be related in any way to the sounds that you're speaking of?
I think it is, and I think it's not without significance that the dawn chorus is mimicked in most of the major religions by the pre-dawn prayers. If you go to an Islamic country and you listen to the prayers that are said before dawn, or you listen to the early morning prayers in a Carthusian monastery, or on Mount Athos with the Orthodox monks, it is very clearly imitative of the dawn chorus. The whole way that the sound moves is totally different to the way it's done in the rest of the day. So we have, as it were, taken inspiration from the birds. I think also it is one of the very few points in our relationship with the rest of creation where we feel that something is done for sheer pleasure. And because we sing from pleasure, because we often sing to praise God or the Buddha or the deities, it has been traditionally interpreted that the birds were singing in honor of God or the divine. Because there is this sense that somehow they're doing what we can also do, but they actually do it rather better than we do. So I think there is, from an environmental and a religious perspective, it's one of the few places, few moments where we feel that there is a real affinity between an aspect of wildlife and ourselves. We have a common experience. But I think also there is this sense that we can never compete with the beauty of that sound, that we are to some degree humbled by that. And in my experience, when you are humbled, then perhaps a little humility, a little hint of the divine can break through into what is otherwise a worldview which often tries to make everything work out very neatly. And so there is a moment, if you like, in which we are reminded that the whole of creation has a purpose and a meaning which transcends us. And in that humility, maybe we transcend our attempt to rationalize everything. We allow ourselves to be open to experience, to go beyond the purely human. And that occasionally, I think, opens the doors to an experience of the transcendent, what I would call an experience of God.
Music to Our Ears was presented by Peter France and produced by Grant Sonics. And in half an hour we'll be able to enjoy the birdsong of the gorgeous birds of paradise as dawn breaks over Papua New Guinea.